Well, it may also provide a new revelation. So you have the distinct possibility that you have a prophet who comes along with a new dispensation, with a new communication from God, which cannot be accommodated, within an organized church.
Hmm.
Islam, for instance, says that the Prophet Muhammad was the last prophet, the seal of the prophets. There cannot be a prophet after Muhammad.
Right.
That pretty much says that's it. Anyone else's direct experience is not as valid or as worthwhile as that of the prophet. So uh, that sort of, to an extreme, says it right there. There's nobody else. There will be no other prophets after that last prophet. In Christianity, Jesus was it. We're waiting for Jesus to come back again, as far as Christians are concerned. We're not waiting for a new Jesus. We're waiting for Jesus the sequel.
Hmm.
So that's another issue. Whoever comes back has to be that. The Jews are waiting for the Messiah. So the Messiah has to have certain attributes and do certain things to be the Messiah. So all these expectations are there. The organizations are in place to serve this one message. An alternate message is not welcome.
So bringing it back to the initial question of the idea of animism, you talk about shamanism and mysticism in one breath, whereas my understanding is they're quite different. I mean, would you see them as synonymous, a shaman and a mystic?
Well, from an academic point of view, you could look at shamanism and mysticism as two things. I mean, the shamanism represents something very specific, a specific practice among a group of people. If you want to be very specific, you could take the Mirsha Eliade approach, which was put the shamans in Siberia, and then you'll locate shamans in various other parts of the world, but with some kind of ethnic connection to the original shamans. We use the word shamanism pretty loosely uh, today, which is unfortunate.
Hmm.
So we could take mysticism and focus on that. That seems to be a bit more universal. A shaman is a kind of mystic,
Hmm.
and a shaman is an animist. To go back to your question, the original shamans were anyway. Although there was a heavy astronomical component to shamanism, climbing a stairway to the stars, an initiatory experience,
Hmm.
which is uh, part animism, part some kind of ancient form of star worship.
My associations, rightly or wrongly, are very much with mysticism being a kind of Eastern practice or perspective, very much to do with going within, very passive and meditative and worshipful. Whereas I see
Hmm.
shamanism closer to our Western tradition of occult ritual or magic, even though shamanism is specifically towards healing stroke transformation. So I think it's more practical or nuts and boltsy than ceremonial. Still, I see it as having a sort of dynamic one-on-one relationship with the environment, hence the idea of animism, whereas I see mysticism very much as a going within, the sort of cliche of the mystic sitting on a mountaintop, or Siddhartha sitting in front of the tree, realizing
But
Maya.
I wonder, I think that the kind of mysticism you describe was only possible in societies that had developed to a certain extent that someone could devote years to this practice, which is not really contributing to the growth of that social class or to that social unit, like the tribe or the clan. I
Mm,
think the shaman was the first, in a sense, or shamanistic practices were the first. It paved the way for the mystics later, because the shamanic initiation involves going out into a desolate area and going within, experiencing a devouring of himself by wild animals, a dismemberment, a death and resurrection scenario,
mhm.
and then coming back to the tribe, the clan, with heightened awareness and perhaps supernatural powers, the ability to talk to spiritual forces. I think the mystic comes back to society kind of the same way, undergoes also a transformative experience through mystical practice.
Mhm.
We may think of Jesus in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, or something like that, some deeply personal experience which brings them into communication with the divine. So I think that the pure mysticism you're talking about, the pure inward looking mystical practices, might have been a development of that. And of course, I'm not speaking academically. I'm just speaking in a kind of general way, as perhaps that's the way it developed. I mean, I don't see a caveman as having performed mystical practices necessarily.
So you think it's
Do you know what I mean?
something of a luxury of more recent times, Less survival based,
I,
perhaps.
I think so. I think so. I think that it had a lot in common with shamanism initially, and I think that the things that I write about, um, mysticism and shamanism as technologies, I think that the technology was kept. It was non-denominational. I mean, anyone could become a mystic, for instance. I mean, there are mystics in the East, there are mystics in the West. In the Russian Orthodox Church, you have the Russian monks who say the Jesus prayer, for instance, as a mantra over and over and over again to reach heightened states of awareness.
Hmm.
You had Teresa of Avila, you had some Christian mystics. So mysticism was broad. I don't know if you found it though in Aboriginal societies, for instance, or even in the ancient Aztec or Mayan societies, if you found mystics,
Hmm.
whereas you would have found, a high priest, a very sophisticated priesthood, sophisticated religion. But I doubt that mysticism was much a part of that.
Are you familiar with the writings of Wilhelm Reich on this particular subject of mysticism?
I'm familiar with Reich a lot. Yes, what writings were you referring to specifically?
Well, I know that when he wrote about the mass psychology of fascism, one of the ways in which
Hmm.
he analyzed Nazism was as a form of politicized mysticism, using mystical ideas
Right.
to control the masses. And he also, I mean, he was generally very averse to or opposed to mysticism,
That's correct. Yes.
but not so much to animism. I think he viewed animism, although it's still somewhat primitive, as being a more fruitful, more healthy, or whatever, however you want to describe that relationship with the universe than mysticism. And I was reading Wright recently about this subject, and the whole question of mysticism versus animism came up at the Stormy Weather blog because of this. And Reich talked about, I didn't quite understand it, this is why I thought I'd bring it up with you to see if you had any ideas. He talked about mysticism being a way to project ideas onto bodily functions, and that the ancient man, or even or modern man indeed, also experienced bodily functions and bodily disorders, and actually projected onto these physical sensations and responses ideas, deities, forces, and then created this sort of mystical belief system that was actually sourced in a purely physical response to the environment. I'm totally paraphrasing now. I'd have to go to the quote to really know what Reich was talking about. But I don't know. Is that familiar to you at all? This idea?
Well, both you have both two statements in there. One is mysticism being used by the Nazis, sort of forced on the people, and then the other idea that mysticism was a way of interpreting the physical world by attributing spiritual identities to bodily functions. I
Hmm.
think they're not mutually exclusive. These are both kind of related.
Hmm.
And it goes to what I said before, mysticism as a kind of luxury of an established class where you have individuals who are now using the old animistic processes and trying to find a place for them in a more modern context or more modern framework. I agree with Reich where the mass psychology of fascism is concerned and how he interpreted it. And in fact, I think that Theodor Adorno had the same feelings. Adorno created what we call the fascism scale, and he saw in fascism elements of occultism, astrology, and all of that. He proclaimed that any kind of occult research was inherently fascist, according to Adorno. And
Hmm.
that was really a development of Reich, who saw the same thing. But the problem with these ideas is that they were germinated by what happened in the Third Reich. So you have a kind of knee-jerk reaction. The Nazis were occultists, therefore occultism is evil.
Hmm.
It's that kind of setup that's very suspicious to me.
Right.
Um, but by the same token, when the government employs mysticism, it is dangerous. It wasn't just Nazi Germany that was doing that. I mean, countries all over the world have done that to one extent or another. The United States actively investigated spiritual practices in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s under the famous operations Bluebird and Artichoke, and eventually MK Ultra and Operation Often, and some of the other projects. This was a deliberate attempt to understand how mysticism worked physically. If you could predict mystical practices get there, predict the reactions you would get. understand how it worked, how to understand the mind, how to understand the brain, how to understand memory, how do mystics operate, how do they do these things. So there was this application of mysticism to the quote unquote real world, to the physical world. Um, the the statement by Reich that mysticism was a kind of perverted animism, if you will, a way of taking physical things and psychologizing them and demonizing them or deifying them to an extent where they became dissociated from their roots, I think is also very important. I think that was the purpose of much mystical practice, was to dissociate from the physical world as much as possible, or to abuse the physical world in order to produce reactions, chemical reactions in the brain, biological reactions that were unknown. The way alchemists would try to force lead to become gold, the mystic was trying to use physical material in order to create spiritual realities. And to Reich, that might have been a perversion of what the original mysticism, if you will, the mysticism, the animistic practices were all about.
Which is about deepening one's connection to nature and the environment, would you say?
Right. And we have a very mechanical approach to this. We're not deepening our connections to nature or the environment. We're trying to control nature and the environment. We're trying to make it jump through hoops, make it perform tricks. And I think that is what mystics of all ages have warned us against, seeking to use mysticism as a source of magical power.
And trying to transcend our physical being before we've fully integrated the experience of it.
Precisely, which is why I think that MK Ultra went wrong, and some of the other mind control practices of the 50s, 60s, and 70s went really off the rails, was that it was dissociated from any kind of spiritual framework.
I mean, would you say that mysticism, because the way that we're talking about it's a very wide field, isn't it? And it's like you're describing mysticism and occult ritual and all the rest as a technology, which is an unusual take. I don't think many people are familiar with this idea. So if that were the case, that like any technology, it would depend entirely how it was being used. And so if mysticism is a way to manipulate consciousness, let's say, and to influence one's connection, one's relationship to one's environment, using ritual and all the rest of it, then is it possible to say that there could be two diametrically opposed ends, let's say, to mysticism? For example, that the pure kind of mysticism, which allows one to deepen one's connection to one's environment and one's inner being and external being, would be a way to explore, or using the technology to actually explore the mystery and plumb the depths, and therefore bring the unconscious to light, which would be a true alchemical process, let's say. Whereas another way to use it, which would seem to be the way it's used politically, is to actually create mystery, to actually create a veil, and to hide from us, to disconnect us from our physical being by giving us ideas that we're not actually ready to assimilate and to practice, and so it causes dissociation.
Yes, I think you've put it pretty succinctly.